Hi, I'm Jim with Infinity PBR, and in this tutorial, I want to give you some scripts to get right to creating story elements in your game. I'll also use some story examples to explain programming concepts because I think they might help people who struggle with C#. So I have a goblin character here, and as the goblin sneaks along, I want her to be able to examine objects she comes across. Player walks up to something, the player sees an icon, presses a button, and then a dialog window comes up with some information. There are simple ways to do this, but we don't want random items around our world needing to talk to our UI manager or checking our player game inputs. So instead, we're going to use a scriptable object event system. This is a drag and drop event workflow that you can use for all kinds of things. I went with item or area of interest dialogues because they could be a useful tool in your game design process. Let's start with a story to explain how this works. In a fantasy February where there is no COVID, you and a date are going out to eat because it is Valentine's Day. All right, so you walk into the restaurant and you see that it is really, really crowded. You walk up to the host and the host looks at you and you look at the host. It's kind of an awkward silence and you realize, oh, the host doesn't have a mouth. So then you say, table for two, please. And you can't read Eldritch, but you're pretty sure he's writing down 2 cool orcs. This is going somewhere, I promise. And then he telepathically hands you this little magical orb. And then he's like, there should be about a 15-minute wait, and gestures you to go to the side, and you're like, whoa, that thing could talk. And then so you go to the waiting area with the other couples who should have made reservations. And at the very moment that you're wondering, what is the stupid magic orb thing, you hear a buzzing coming from the slimes to your right. And you see that their orb is glowing. Then the slimes go to the host. They give back the orb, and the host seats them at their table. So these orbs that let people know their table is ready seem to each be listening on some sort of channel where a signal might come through. And when the restaurant host presses some kind of button, let's say, and sends out an event on that channel, the orb responds. And then you respond to the orb and have a great date. All right, let's take a look at how this works in Unity. I've selected the orb, and I see that there's a script called Orb Buzzer on it. I'll add an event listener script to the orb so it can listen in on an event channel. On the event listener, it's asking for an event channel to listen to. I'll need to make an event channel scriptable object to drop in here. Unlike model behavior scripts, scriptable objects aren't attached to game objects, though we can reference them as we're doing. Scriptable objects are assets, and we can make them with the Create Asset menu. So I'll right-click and go to Create, and then go to Scriptable Objects and create a game event channel. And then I'll call the channel Table Ready. Then I'll go back to the orb and put the event channel on the game event listener. Now we can set up a response to the event coming through on this channel. And what I want to happen is inside the orb buzzer. So let's take a look at the orb buzzer. The orb buzzer is really simple. We declare a variable for an animator, we get our animator, and on the method OrbBuzz, we trigger the parameter buzzTrigger, and that transitions us from an idle state to a buzzing state, which has a buzzing animation, which is right here. And here's the beauty of this. We can call the OrbBuzz method here as a response to an event on the table ready channel that we just made. So all we need to do is click plus, and then drag in our orb buzzer. And then in this drop-down menu, look for orb buzzer, and then the method orb buzz. And now our orb is all set up so that when some event, whatever it is, comes through that table ready channel, a parameter buzz trigger is going to trigger our transition to the buzzing state, which has this animation. We need something to broadcast on this table ready channel and send an event in it. For that, I have a game object called signal emitter. The signal emitter doesn't know about the orb game objects. For that reason, I want to disable the I here because it gives the wrong impression. The signal emitter doesn't need to know about the orbs, what the orbs do in response to the event, or things about the guests, like that the slimes are both cheating on each other. All the restaurant host signal script needs is the game event channel table ready so it can broadcast on the same channel as the listener. And here's where we call the event on the channel. We start a coroutine, inform table is ready, and after 5 seconds, we raise an event on the channel. All right, I'm going to press play, and it works. Before we move on to the examine object implementation with the goblin, let's take a closer look at the game event listener and the game event channel, and I hope that the lead up to this has made it easier to understand. When this object is enabled, the listener is going to register itself to the channel. The event channel is a scriptable object that we create through the asset menu. The channel has a method called registerListener, and this way the listener adds itself to a list with any other listeners there might be. So anything out there that has an event listener with this channel adds itself to this list. You could have a ton of listeners out there tuning into this channel like radios. And then we have a method for raising the event. Then we loop through all the listeners starting from the top. And you can think of that like cards in a deck. If we remove a card, we won't throw the order off as we go down the list. On every listener, we call a function onEventRaised. And onEventRaised is here on our listener. And that is the response to the game event. That is the Unity event that we set up in the inspector. In the case of the orb, it was the orb buzz. So let's take a look at that again. We have the signal emitter raising an event on the channel. And then in the listener, we have a Unity event set up for any kind of response we want to hook up in the inspector. We can have multiple orbs out there listening for the event, and they can each respond to that event in a unique way. And one final thing, just as a guest returns the orb, the listener should deregister itself. When it's disabled and no longer needed, it removes itself from the list of listeners. Let's get back to the first goblin scene, and you can get this project at the link below. I am using the new input system, so you'll probably want to use a 2020 version of Unity or beyond. So in scenes, there's a scene called Project Goblin Tutorial 1. Let's take a look at these example objects. So each object has a game event listener on it with a game event channel. If every object had the same channel, the interaction icons would all pop up at once. So every object needs a unique channel. Let's take a look at the player, and then we'll go through the steps of creating one of these story dialogue objects or items. Underneath the Goblin player, I have an object called Interaction. On that object is a box collider marked as a trigger, and there's a script called InteractionManager. When the player moves and something enters the trigger, the InteractionManager will check the tag of the object, and if it's tagged Examinable Object as it's set up now, the manager will get whatever broadcast channel the listener wants and set its broadcast channel to the listeners and then immediately broadcast to it. It's like if you have a walkie-talkie and you found another one on the ground and you set your channel to the one you found and then started talking to it. There's no event channel to drag in the inspector for the icon events. I made it private because it's going to change every time we come across something new that's examinable. The response from that immediate event that I have set up in the inspector is to call a method called switchIconVisibility, and that is on a child object, examinObjectIcon. So your event response could be on another object, and here is displayInteractiveIcon. The switchIconVisibility method in this script turns on and off the sprite renderer. The other thing on our object outside of the game event listener is this script called Examinable Object Info. This is where we write the string message we want to have displayed. The string will be set to another kind of scriptable object just for string data. The interaction manager will save it to another scriptable object for the text canvas. At the end of the video, I will talk about why this system is just a step in designing and developing your games. In fact, this implementation is probably right before I should switch it to something else. Let's go through the steps of putting together an examinable object so you can do this implementation with something of interest in your game, say a sign, note, or even one line of dialogue from an NPC. I'm going to use baby chicks because I want the goblin character to eat one of them soon into the game. And the baby chicks are under this parent object. So on that object, add a box collider and make it a trigger, and also add a rigid body that has no gravity and is marked as kinematic. This is all for the player's onTriggerEnter tag check in the interaction manager. Next, add a tag for examinable object, like I have it here, and if you're just making the tag, you need to go back to the object and set it. Okay, then add the event listener to the game object. Let's create an event channel for the listener. I create and keep those in a folder for scriptable object assets called event channels. I'm right-clicking in the folder for the Create Asset menu, and I'll make a new event channel and call it Baby Chicks Icon Display. Now I'll add the channel to the listener, and for the response, create a sprite object that has your icon you want to show the player. I have my sprite as a child, and from the scripts folder, drag a script called Display Interactive Icon to the sprite. The script is asking for our sprite renderer component, so drag that in. All the script does is enable or disable the renderer with the method switchIconVisibility. Back on the parent, let's set up the response for the event on the channel. Click the plus, and drag in the sprite game object. Go into the dropdown for the function or method to call, and go into the Display Interactive Icon script, and there at the bottom is the function we want, switchIconVisibility. The Interaction Manager sends an event both on enter and on exit, and this switches the icon. There's one more script to get for this, and that's Examinable Object Info. Drag that to the game object, and this is for our text. For now, the Interaction Manager grabs this info and saves it for the canvas. You can type whatever you want to display here, and it will save it to a scriptable object that just holds a string. That might be useful for later on if you wanted to keep a log of what the player knows. Let's make one of these string value scriptable objects to keep and send around the info we're typing in the inspector. I've created mine in a folder called item SO data, and you can create them the same way you create game event channels in the create asset menu, scriptable objects, and string value. In scripts and in scriptable object data, you can see that this scriptable object is just a container holding a string. Back on the baby chicks, drag and drop the string value scriptable object. Any string we write in the inspector will save to the scriptable object. That means it will overwrite any info there. That's fine for now because this is an early design stage implementation. And like I said in the intro, writing things in the inspector feels like writing your game in your game. So I'm going to type something random here and then press play. And I see I have an error. I'll fix that in a moment. But first I want to show you that if you go to item SO data, the string value that we typed is now saved. Now let's tackle that error. The error comes from the Interaction Manager. I see that the manager is missing a string value object. Whatever dialog string for the object the player is examining will be saved to this object. The dialog canvas also references this object and will display whatever text the player has saved to it. So I already have a string value object set up for this in the folder dialog SO data. I'll drag that into the slot for examine object text. So we can also see that our Interaction Manager is broadcasting on a channel, and that channel is called Examine Object Dialog. And one of the weaknesses of the system here is that you can't see what all has this event channel, so naming things is important. Let's go into the dialog canvas, and there we can see that we have another game event listener, and it's listening on that Examine Object Dialog channel. The response is a activate dialog window method on a script called dialog displayer, and that script is right here. The script references that same examine object info text string value scriptable object that the player is setting from the baby chicks. That means our dialog canvas doesn't need to know about the baby chicks and doesn't need to know about the player. And maybe you've spotted it, but I have a typo on my dialog canvas. So I'm going to fix that, and you'll see that the Unity event here, if I maybe click off and click on again, the Unity event that's set up here will update to the new name. And that's great because that means you won't break the event listener by renaming things. All right, so I'll show you the scripts in a moment, but let's press play and see. Now I'm pressing the E key and I'm not seeing any dialogue, but it is working. We need to go into free aspect and change it to 1920 by 1080. And there we go. Let's go over the scripts we've talked about. The project uses the new input system, and the input action setup is in a folder called settings. Selecting it will give you an option in the inspector to edit the asset, and I'm only using one action map called gameplay. That's where I have the interact action set up for the E key or the WEST button on a gamepad. In the Interaction Manager, this is how we're sending the event on the Examine Object Dialog channel. But first, let's look at the simple player character movement script to see how we subscribe methods to input events. This script uses a scriptable object called InputReader. This is an idea from Unity's open project, and I included a link to the video below that explains what this is. The InputReader allows us to access inputs from any script. In the player character script, we're using it for movement. OnMove takes in a float for our left-right controller input values, and then we make use of that in a move method that moves the player back and forth and rotates her around. The interaction button isn't doing anything here, just flipping a bool. We're using the button in the Interaction Manager to send an event to the dialog canvas. As for the Interaction Manager script, this is simplified from Unity's open project. For example, I just have examine as one interaction type here, menu or dialog could be other types. I've commented things, so you should be able to get a good idea of what all this is for. We subscribe on interaction button press to our interact button event in the input reader. When we press the interact button, we raise events on channels for the object. That's the one that responds with switching the icon off. and we raise an event to the dialog channel. This turns the dialog on. If dialog is already up, we raise those events again, and that flips the dialog off and the icon back on. All of this happens after the onTriggerEnter, where we've hit a game object tagged Examinable object. Then we get info from the object, like the string for the dialog panel and the event channel, where we immediately raise the event to flip the icon on. On trigger exit, we reset interaction. We'll send the event to close the dialog if it was open, and if not, we'll switch off the icon. Then we clear out our interaction type and the interactive object info. In the last script, our dialog displayer references the examine object string value scriptable object, and that is set on a TextMeshPro component so we can read the text. The examine object dialog event turns on and off the dialog window panel. So the script is similar to the icon script in that we're switching, in this case, a game object to be active or inactive. Before I conclude, I wanted to mention some drawbacks to scriptable object-based events. The first two issues are brought up by Jason Story at Infallible Code. Number one, he says that everything becomes an asset. You end up having a bunch of stuff, the event channels, in your project folder. Secondly, he notes that Unity events, the response on the listeners, are the slowest of events that you can use. And then in conversation with Ciro at Unity, he said it's hard to track down references. We can't click on an asset and see what scripts are using it. So there's this question of what is listening to or broadcasting on what event channel. There's no way of really knowing without looking at all the game objects. Ryan Hipple, who first introduced this, has since clarified that the SO events are mostly for exposing things to designers, and eventually these are changed to something else, like C# events. To demonstrate this, I'm going to go really quick back to the orbs. Let's change this from the SO event system to C# events. First, I'll make a public static action, which is the same thing as an event. We can just write it on one line. And to use actions, we need to use the system namespace. I'll call the event table ready event. We'll want to check if there's a listener for it, and if there is, we'll call the event. On the orb buzzer, let's register the orb buzz method to the event, and then remove orb buzz on disable. And that's all there is to it, since this is a pretty simple example. Let's check if it works, and it works. Awesome. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that was helpful, and if you'd like to support the channel, please subscribe. You can also check us out in the asset store and wishlist a monster or two. All right, see ya!